This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And my name is Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church here in London. And no, Kevin has not forgot how to use a camera on his computer. He's sticking his Detroit Tiger hat up there for a purpose.
I am indeed, because they really won the series against the Jays. But my name is Kevin George, and I am the Dean at St. Paul's Cathedral in the Diocese of Huron. And I'm glad to be with you as well with my buddy Rob. And the last time we did this, we were standing on a corner right in front of Comerica Park.
We were on Woodward Avenue in downtown Detroit.
Yep. We were excited because the Tigers had just beaten the Jays. And the next day we missed a good one.
The next day they beat the Jays again.
The
best part about them beating the Jays was we went to the game with some Jays fans.
We did.
That always makes it a little extra sweet.
We did. It was pretty nice to see them sort of, whinge and complain. That was pretty good. But it was nice to be in Detroit. We got to go to Hockeytown Cafe, where I famously once lost my wallet. Right.
That's right. and surprisingly, maybe it came close this time too. But
I came close. Yeah. And then we went to Lafayette for Coney Islands after.
Yeah, that was good. Ooh.
That was good.
Yeah.
Then I got some Tums on the way home.
You got some Tums. That's right. That's right.
Anyway, sorry, Rob, to interrupt the progress of this.
That's all right.
I just want to reminisce about our time in Detroit. I think it was good.
No, we had a great time. It was good to get away and have some fun, do that.
Yeah.
So we welcome you back. We've got another episode today of our 10th season, episode 5 today, and we're excited to welcome to the podcast Murray Watson. Murray, I'm just meeting Murray today. Kevin known Murray for years, and we'll connect all those dots in a minute. But Murray is a Catholic biblical scholar and an interreligious activist. He is co-founder of the Center for Jewish Christian Muslim Learning here in London, Ontario. And Murray writes and speaks widely about biblical and interfaith topics. And he is currently the adult faith formation animator for the Simcoe, Muskoka Catholic District School Board. Ooh, say that 3 times
That's
fast.
a lot. That's a lot.
And Murray is in Barrie, Ontario. So we'll connect with Murray. And we're going to talk about his new book, which is Restoring the Gospel's Jewish Voice, Andrei Shiraki, and the Intersection of Biblical Translation and Interfaith Dialogue. And for you YouTube watchers, there's the cover of the book right there. So Murray coming up here in a minute.
Distinguished looking fellow, isn't he? Look at him.
Oh, he is. Yeah.
That Andrei Shiraki
and everything.
Yeah, that Andrei Shiraki. And he was a politician in Israel. Like that guy was amazing. Anyway.
Amazing guy. Yeah.
Amazing guy. Anyway, we do want to acknowledge before we get too far into this that the land upon which we record this podcast is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples. These are lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796, the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We acknowledge that these lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land, vital contributors of our society, and people with whom we wish to walk together on the two-road path towards reconciliation. And too often these things can come off as something that we just say. I want to acknowledge that even in saying it, it seems like a rote at times, but for Rob and I, it's an ongoing evolution of our learning. We continue to struggle with ways that we've benefited from our white supremacy and the ways in which we've participated in the brokenness, and continue to try and seek ways to find ways to participate in that healing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said, my friend. Good. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors on the Vickers Crossing podcast. To A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And again, our thanks to Dave Mullen and the staff at A. Miller George today. Thanks for helping out and tuning in and being so supportive.
Great guys. In fact, we have a guest coming up soon that Dave has brought to us, and you're going to really love it. Some of the work that this guy is doing, photographer, amazing. Lots to learn. Stay tuned. We also give thanks to the Diocese of Huron. The Diocese of Huron, of course, important to Rob and I because it is the source of our paycheck. But beyond that, it's also a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve. And Rob's parish is one example, mine's another. And we're thankful to Todd Townsend, our bishop, and the people who are in leadership at the Diocese of Huron for supporting this podcast.
And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Our thanks to Tricia Lister for her support, and we give a big shout out to Molly Maid and all the fine staff there.
Clean, man. It's clean.
It's clean. All right. Now, Murray's waiting in Barrie.
He is. He's up in
slipped
Barrie,
in. Yep.
knocking on the door.
He's knocking on the door. So let's welcome in Murray. Let's find out a bit more about Andre Shiraki and his new book that Murray's wrote.
And let's find out a little bit more about you and Barrie and about Murray and Newfoundland. And Murray and Newfoundland.
Yeah. I almost ended up in Barrie at one point in my life.
Yeah. So
and the connection to Murray and you. So.
Yeah. So there's some stuff to learn. So let's bring in Murray.
And Murray Watson joining us now here on the Vickers Crossing podcast from beautiful Barrie, Ontario. Murray, welcome. And we're glad you're here. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you both for the invitation.
Now, it bears saying that Murray and I have known each other for over 30 years. Rob is first introduction to Murray. Yeah. What I know is that Murray was a classmate of my wife, Catherine Ann, who was in seminary at St. Peter's. Well, now there's a story. I got a wife at St. Peter's Seminary.
Yeah, people are going, what do you say?
Not everybody can go to a den of male celibacy and pluck out a wife, but I got one. So, anyway, but that's a story for a different day, right? Yeah. But Murray, we connected because Murray is a Newfoundlander as well as I'm a Newfoundlander. And Murray has rich Newfoundland roots because Murray's family is actually connected to Confederation. So welcome to the podcast, Murray, and tell us about your connection to Confederation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Kevin. Yeah, we have that in common, and I'm very proud of that part of my heritage. I was born in St. John's, Newfoundland. We moved when I was 5 to Ontario, but my mom and her family have deep roots in Newfoundland. We so much so that when my mother went to apply for a passport in the 1980s, she was of the generation that was born in when Newfoundland was still a British colony.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was one of those who helped to negotiate Newfoundland in the Confederation in 1949. But
now that's as close to Newfoundland royalty as you can get in my family. We're strong Confederates, so that is
depending on who you talk to, that's a good thing. But mom was one of that generation who went to bed one day British and woke up the next day Canadian. And when it came time to get a passport, was unable to get a passport because she had no documentation that she was Canadian. And it was on the basis of an autograph book that the Prime Minister of Canada had signed that day to my mother that she was able to get a Canadian passport.
Yes, and what did it say? Tell us what it said.
It said to Miss Elizabeth McAvoy, congratulations and welcome to Canada, Louis Saint Laurent, Prime Minister of Canada. And my mother photocopied that, sent that into the passport office, and on that basis, they gave her a Canadian passport.
Give me my damn passport. I got it from Louis Saint Laurent.
That's right. That's right. Man, that's a keepsake, huh? That's something else. Wow.
Now, Rob, did I hear you say before we got on here that you almost ended up in Barrie? How did that happen?
In Barrie, yeah. Well, it was the early 90s, and I just 2 or 3 years into my radio broadcasting career, and a buddy of mine went up to Barrie to work at what was then Rock 95, Barrie's Rock. I don't know if it's still on the air there or not.
Just down the street from me.
Oh, really? Okay, cool.
It's still going.
Yeah, so anyway, I applied for some position, and I can't exactly remember what happened. I never went up for an interview or anything, but there was a time I remember thinking, I'm moving to Barrie.
Well, I know what happened. God
But
got involved. God got
God
involved.
got involved. Yeah, exactly.
You ended up being a priest,
Exactly.
Rob.
I
You're
ended
not.
up going down another road. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now you
But
just get up on Sunday morning and say, "Hey there, hold there, parishioners! You are welcome to Holy Trinity St. Stephen's. We're glad to
that's
have you
right.
with us.
In
The
my in
Lord
my
be with you."
in my rock and
Now, a
roll
word from our
voice. Yeah.
sponsor.
No,
That's
we're
right.
from.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll be back after
Yeah.
these
Well, look,
messages.
we're very thankful to you, Murray, for joining us from Barrie.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And I have to say, I have this book here. I'll hold it up for the YouTube people.
Yeah.
Restoring the Gospel's Jewish Voice. And Andre, I'm going to say it wrong. So you say it.
Shiraki.
Shiraki. It's like a Rocky with a Shah on the front. Andre
Exactly.
Shiraki and the intersection of
Shiraki.
biblical translation and interfaith dialogue. Thank you for the free copies. We love
You
the
are
book.
most welcome. Thank you to my publisher.
And I should say before we go any further that St. Paul's Cathedral here is hosting a book launch of this book on June the 9th. So you're going to be getting this just about a week ahead of that date. So if you're in the London area or anywhere within striking distance, drive on down and see us at 472 Richmond and come in and meet Murray and hear about the book and buy some books. And it'll be great to see you. So we're looking forward to having you, Murray.
Thanks. I'm excited.
So a little bit of a chat about the book. Let's start with where you start, which is you begin this book with a question to the reader. You write Nathan Andre Shakari.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of him? Is your question.
Yes.
And then you say, probably not. And so I wonder if you could tell our listeners who was this great man and why his life and work is so important.
No, thank you. I suspect that most people who are listening to this have probably never heard of him either. Up until 20 years ago, I had no idea who he was. And that's largely because his work is almost completely in French. So unless you read French, there's very little available in English. And that was part of the impetus for me to do the work that led to this book. Shiraki was one of the great pioneers of Jewish Christian and interfaith dialogue. He started doing it back in the 1940s before it was cool, before it was mainstream at all. But that was grounded in the fact that he was a North African Jew, an Arab speaking Jew. His family had left Spain in the late 1300s and they had settled in North Africa. His family had been there for 500 or 600 years by the time he was born. He grew up in a world that was he grew up in a predominantly Muslim country that was at the time part of colonial France. So lots of the hierarchy of the country were largely French Catholics, and a lot of his family's employees and colleagues were Muslims. So he spent his childhood moving back and forth between those three different religions, three different languages, three different cultures. Eventually went to Sorbonne for studies at the university. And while he was there, the Nazis were beginning to threaten France and eventually invaded France. While he was studying at a rabbinic seminary, went into the French underground and fought in the French underground, and in that time became friends with somebody who's kind of recognized as the godfather of modern Jewish Christian relations, a Jewish French historian named Jules Isaac. The two of them became friends and co-conspirators during the war, and after the war, they established some of the first Jewish Christian friendship associations, study circles that are really the beginnings of the modern interfaith movement that we see today. Lots of both Jews and Christians were really struggling after the war with what had happened. The Christians were grappling with how Christians had not stood up for their Jewish brothers and sisters during the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And Shiraki and Isaac and others said, we need to ensure that this can never happen again. And they believed that could best be done through education. So that was his inauguration into interfaith movements through the experience of the war and the Holocaust, but also informed by his experience of growing up in multicultural Algeria.
Well, I have to say, je m'excuse. I don't speak French very well, but I know that little bit. And when I read this book, I was like, je m'excuse. I just felt like I missed something, that this guy's life is so big. And because as both of you gentlemen know, I'm quite involved in a lot of interfaith dialogue. And the fact that I didn't even know who this guy was until I picked up your book was shocking to me. I was like, wow, this guy has been really incredibly important. This is an incredibly interesting book, Murray, and I hope a lot of people are picking it up to read it. You really do bring together so many interesting aspects of Shiraki's life and as well as biblical scholarship, because um, not to put too fine a point on it, but the guy on the screen or in your ear that you're hearing now, this Murray Watson, is quite a biblical scholar himself. He wouldn't necessarily advertise that, but the guy has done some incredible studies in Rome and elsewhere. He's an amazing guy, and what you've put together in this book is really quite something. I wanted to ask you about something that many people take for granted today that you point out in the book that was still quite radical in the early 1970s when Shakari was in his prime, I guess. And that is, and as you write it in the book, that the New Testament is fundamentally Jewish literature. You write about his efforts to allow for a Jesus who more naturally belongs in the first century world, and his words can inspire and challenge in strikingly new ways. Tell our listeners, if you will, a little bit about Shakari's desire for his Jewish friends to begin to appreciate the quintessential Jewishness of Jesus in the New Testament.
Today for many of us that seems so obvious. It seems like a no-brainer that Jesus was Jewish. But if you know anything of Christian history, you know that for most of 1900 years, Christians, invested a lot of energy in denying that and separating Judaism from Jesus, denying that Judaism had anything to do with Jesus, because Christianity had such a really a toxic relationship with Judaism for most of our history. It was a very painful relationship. So up until, for the most part, up until the 1960s, there were not a lot of people who explored that importance at all. There were a few back in the 1600s. There was an Anglican bishop named John Lightfoot who dedicated himself to studying Jewish texts so that he could understand the Gospels better. In the 1930s and 40s, there were some Jewish scholars who were beginning to look at that, but it was still a very, very narrow, very, very niche approach. And then in the 1960s, there was a whole renewal, largely because of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the 1940s, when all of a sudden we had a new sense of some of the pluralism that existed within Judaism. And Jewish scholars started to, because of interreligious dialogue, started to open up to the idea that the Gospels in particular were a Jewish story about a Jewish figure speaking a Semitic language, Hebrew or Aramaic. So Shiraki was really on the cutting edge of that from a Jewish perspective. When he started translating his Bible in the early 1970s, that was not at all taken for granted. There were a lot of Jewish scholars who looked askance at him, couldn't understand why he would bother to translate the New Testament as part of this bigger translation project he was engaged in. Lots of Christians who thought that it was a very odd idea as well. As I say, today we have shelves and shelves. Most of the shelves behind me are the Jewishness of Jesus and understanding that background.
Yeah.
But Shiraki had a strong sense already in the 60s and 70s that could be a bridge that could help to heal the relationship between Jews and Christians. He wanted Christians to be aware that Jesus was fundamentally Jewish, but he also wanted Jews to be aware of that. And he was one of the first generation of people who helped to make those connections that today, lots and lots of scholars make and take for granted. But he was doing it at a time long before it was mainstream.
So just to mind down a little bit too for our listeners, before we go on to some other stuff here, there is a French translation of the New Testament that is in Shakari's name. You want to just say a word about that so people understand the importance of what he did, right?
Oh, there it
Yeah.
is.
So he was, from the time he was young, he felt that none of the French translations that he saw really did justice to the Hebrew. Hebrew is a very playful language. It's a language with lots of nuances and loves to drill into the etymology and the meanings of words. He didn't think any of the existing French translations did a good job of that. So as soon as he got retired from politics in the late 60s, early 70s, he decided he wanted to personally translate the whole Bible himself in the way that he felt it should be translated. Very literal, in a very clunky way. So he did. He started at the beginning, and over the course of 3 or 4 years, he translated the whole Hebrew scriptures. And then he decided he was going to continue on with the New Testament, felt that if he was ever going to do justice to Jewish Christian dialogue, he really needed to delve into the New Testament and translate it word by word, letter by letter. Which was as I say, was quite avant-garde at the time. He later, 20 years later, made his own translation of the Quran. Only person I found in history who has single-handedly translated all three of the Abrahamic scriptures. So he was a remarkable intellectual. His background in Hebrew enabled him to do the Old Testament. His French colonial schooling had taught him Hebrew and Latin and Greek, so he was able to translate the New Testament, and his background in Arabic enabled him to translate the Quran. But he was always translating the New Testament through the lens of what he knew about Judaism and what he could hypothesize about what Jesus, because of course we only have the New Testament in Greek, but Jesus didn't speak Greek. So we're always trying to guess what might have been the Hebrew or the Aramaic behind the Greek. Right. And Shiraki had a background that enabled him to make some really interesting hypotheses.
Rob, this raises an important question.
Which is?
Well, given Murray's propensity for languages, how many do you speak, Murray?
3 that I speak.
You read?
5 others that I read.
That he reads, okay. So given that, is there a Newfoundland translation of the New Testament about to come out? Like
there's Kevin, you could produce that.
No, I don't read the languages, but you read the Hebrew, the Greek, the whole thing. So I could help you. I could sit by your side and you could say, Kevin, help me. I would help you, but I think there should be a Newfoundland New Testament out there is what I believe.
Okay, I'm with you, brother.
That's next. Yeah.
Over to you, Rob. But anyway, it's burning in my brain.
Burning in your brain.
Yeah.
So this is interesting too. So we're mentioning the biblical translation that Shiraki did. This is fascinating. There's no Jesus in this translation. And what you point out, Murray, in the book is you point out that the reason for that is there was no one in the world who was called by that name. So when I say there's no Jesus, not the man Jesus, but the name, the form Jesus is at least 3 steps removed from the name by which we'd know Yeshua, that was familiar to his contemporaries. And you point out that this has cultural implications and consequences for interpretations of several important passages. So can you talk a little bit to us about kind of the roots of biblical names, why they're so important? And you speak to examples like, Adam and Isaac, and of course, Jesus or Yeshua. Say more about why this matters.
Sure.
Well, shout out before you do. Shout out to John Marsh, who always says Yeshua instead of Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, it makes a difference on a lot of levels. First of all, it reminds us that this is a first century Jewish person that we're talking about, and that this is, so maybe we need to set aside some of our presuppositions, our 21st century Western presuppositions, to enter into that world. So on one hand, it's a reminder of that. Right. But biblical names, proper names in the Bible, almost always are related to root words. They have a meaning. Sometimes there's a whole sentence within them. And when you dig into the name of the meaning, the meaning of the name, you often see connections with that person's story. Right. So for example, Isaac in the Old Testament, his name, Itzhak, comes from a verb tzahak that means to laugh or to play around. And if you read the story of Isaac, you'll see 7 or 8 times in his story there's reference to people laughing, there's playing around, which would have made perfect sense in an oral culture that knew the Hebrew derivation. Lost on us today, it's really hard to bring out in translation. And it's the same thing with Jesus. His name, Yeshua, comes from a verb yasha, a Hebrew verb yasha, that has something to do with rescuing or saving. It means something like he will save. It's a future tense verb. Which comes through a few different places. And so, for example, when the angel speaks to Joseph in a dream that Mary is going to have a child, and you will name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. That makes no sense in Greek or English or French. Makes perfect sense in Hebrew. It's kind of like saying, you will name him, he will save, for he will save his people from their sins. But unless you know that whole story, that part of the story is completely dense and is lost on.
Right.
And then throughout the story of Jesus, there's all kinds of ways that that idea of saving gets brought up again and again and again, if you know that. So when Jesus is hanging on the cross, the Gospels consistently say the people who are mocking him say, you should save yourself, save these other people, save us, save everybody. Um, why are they so consistent about that? Well, his name meant he will save. So they were mocking the meaning of his name and saying, you can't save anybody.
Right. Right.
But there's, the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. Everybody is singing Hosanna. Well, Hosanna comes from the same verb, yesha, which means to save. It means save us, please.
Yes.
Right.
Now we just think of it as a triumphant celebration, a celebratory term, but in its original meaning, it was save us, please, from the oppression of the Romans, from this terrible violence that we're suffering. And people who knew Hebrew would have seen the connection between Hosanna and the name of Jesus. So there's a lot of ways in which that idea of saving, when you know that that's Jesus' name in its original form, then you start seeing it everywhere in the Gospels, and you realize for first century storytellers, this would have been an important thread in understanding who he was and why he was doing what he was doing.
Absolutely. Have you ever, this happens to me all the time when I'm doing like Bible studies. You'll see people's eyes just light right up when suddenly we talk about a passage and they realize the meaning of the name. Like then, like you say, Marie, the whole story opens up and they go, "Oh, wow!" Like, I think of, Jacob wrestles with the angel or God and is renamed Israel, which doesn't that mean one who has striven or one who,
Yeah.
that kind of thing, right? So yeah, it's
So
fascinating
so
stuff.
so names in the Bible almost never are just names. There's almost always
Yeah.
more to them. There's a three-dimensionality there that connects to their story. And when you know that background, then all of a
Yeah.
sudden the story comes alive at a
Oh,
whole different level.
it's wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. So speaking of words and their usage, let's talk about the word rabbi.
Yes.
So you point out in the book, you say there are typically 15 rabbi references in Matthew and Mark and John, and the related form, Rabune, if I'm saying that right, occurs twice in Mark 10 and in John 20. And in the Gospel according to John, Rabune literally means my teacher or my master, but it's used elsewhere simply as an equivalent to the common word rabbi, which most of us know and say. But it's used elsewhere. So by contrast, Shakure employs rabbi 53 times in his Gospels, the expected 15 times, but also including the evangelist's use of the Greek noun for teacher. And using this title with reference to Jesus obviously resonates, linguistically with modern Jewish readers for whom rabbi is a familiar term and role in their congregations. It establishes an immediate connection and inserts Jesus into a well-known Jewish category. Murray wrote that, by the way. That's not me saying that.
Well, I thought you
I'm
said
not
all.
that smart.
Sounds
I
I'm
thought-
good
not that
tripping
smart.
off your tongue.
But it's
That-
like, yeah,
That
exactly.
Rob
But
is
it's
friggin' Rob. You're
that's
brilliant.
pretty good, huh? I was just reading from Murray's book.
That man is
Don't
brilliant.
think for a minute that I could come up with that. I'm still working my way through the Jane and Dick and Spot stories.
Ed
So,
Shackery. Ed Shackery.
yeah, exactly. Shackery.
Yeah.
But anyway, could you say more about the importance of this amplified use of the word rabbi for us? Murray?
Sure. So this is a little bit controversial because he takes, as you said, there are references where the word rabbi itself is used a lot of times in the Gospels with reference to Jesus. But he then says, if Jesus was speaking and the people around Jesus are speaking Hebrew, every time that we see the word teacher, he said that is probably rabbi in Hebrew or Aramaic. So wherever there's teacher, he also inserts rabbi in there because he said that was just the term in that world that you used for a distinguished teacher, someone that you showed reverence for, someone that you were learning from. So he expands on it, and so it's a little bit controversial. People look and say, well, is that really what underlies it? And we don't know. On all of this, all we can do is hypothesize. We can speculate in an informed way. I think that there's a lot to recommend that. Probably it was in that world. Rabbi was the term that was used, but it's not there in the text. This is one of the places where he goes a little bit beyond the text and brings his Jewish lens to the Greek New Testament and says, but it must have been X. And he does that in a number of different places, all the way through his knowledge of Judaism, his knowledge of the land of Israel that he knew really very well. And another example of him doing the same thing, where Jesus says, "Consider the lilies of the field." He says, "I've lived here. There are no lilies that grow in the fields." He said, "Lilies are cultivated in gardens." He said, "There are no wild lilies. However," he says, "there are a number of plants that look a lot like lilies, and that would have the same characteristics, and that from a distance would look like lilies." So he
Interesting.
gets into a whole discussion, and he says it was probably a different type of flower. And it's interesting that a number of modern Bible translations have shifted away from lilies, and they just say, "Consider the flowers."
Flowers of the field.
As they said,
Oh, really?
2,000
Okay.
years later,
Yeah.
it's really, really hard to make that equivalence between what was being referred to 2,000 years ago and the flowers that we've got today. So,
But
so there's a certain,
you know
yeah.
what strikes me before I ask the next plan question I have for you is would you say that there's a little bit of like Eugene Peterson about this? Like, I mean,
For sure.
like Eugene Peterson's The Message, right? Is most biblical scholars would say, well, that's not a translation, right? I mean, he's taking some license and he is trying to bring the scripture to life in terms of modern English sort of contemporary understanding of what was trying to be communicated.
No, absolutely. And this is one of the critiques people have made. They said, is it really a translation, or is it a translation with interpretations woven into it, kind of subtly woven into it? And that's one of the things some people have criticized him for. They said, you go beyond a translation into what the Jewish tradition calls midrash.
Midrash,
You start to kind of expand on and explain, and so some people call it super explanatory translation. Some people like that about it. Some people don't. Some people said, this is stuff you put in the footnotes. This is not stuff you put in the translation. But
no, I wish I read. I wish I read French though, because one of the things I do every week as I read our lectionary is I read The Message as well as the New Revised Standard Version, not because I need it in any way, but it shifts the lens in a different way, and I think from reading your book about Shakare, I see that same sense of it changes the perspective, particularly as it relates to Jewish folks reading New Testament literature, which is, as he's pointed out, a Jewish text. Anyway.
Well, and that's the benefit that we have today is, today we've got dozens and dozens of brilliant Jewish scholars whose education is in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And they come to our conferences and they sit down with us and they bring all the centuries of learning that they have about Judaism. And they tell us what they see in the text that often is not obvious to us. And they say, well, that was obviously such and such he was referring to, or that was such and such a holiday. And they see things jump off the page because they're Jewish that we Christians, or most Christians, don't see.
Right. I mean, I think of AJ Levine. We've had her on the podcast a couple of times. I mean, she is the preeminent New Testament scholar. Really, she's Jewish, but she sees things that we just miss.
Absolutely. And she, today we have AJ was one of the co-editors of the Jewish Annotated New Testament.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what she and the other scholars do. There's probably 50 Jewish scholars who contributed essays and commentary to that.
Yeah.
But that didn't exist 50 years ago when Shoraki was doing this.
Yeah.
That was still decades away. Most of the scholars who were part of this hadn't even been born yet.
They stand on the shoulders of him, in a way. Like it's really right there. So I was fascinated by the section in the book about stripping away of the Hellenistic influence on translation, right? And reimagining the Hebrew context. You write in the book, today it's commonplace of New Testament historical and theological scholarship that Jesus was born a Jew, was raised in a devout Jewish family, and remained a Jew until his death. Although scholars today question specifically what type of Jew Jesus was within the constellation of Second Temple Jewish sects and movements, it's generally agreed that Jesus's lifestyle and network were, broadly speaking, consistent with what we know of Jewish life at that time, especially in small-town Galilee. Consequently, Shoraki and many others today are at pains to highlight some of the ways in which Jesus's Jewishness is presented, or at least hinted at, in the Gospels. Attempting to read between the lines, you write, of the existing Greek text, Shakari asked himself, is there a specifically Jewish or Semitic concept that might plausibly lie beneath the present Hellenistic garb? And you use that term sort of broadly and specifically, garb. For example, the question has often been raised that the best way to translate the Greek noun kraspedon, yeah, is that anywhere close to Greek?
Yeah, you're right. Right on.
Which is found in singular or plural form 5 times in the Gospels, each time with reference to the garments of Jesus. The vernacular translations of the hem of Jesus's cloak, Shakari sees this differently. I wonder if you could say more about that and about that sort of stripping away. And I think you said the verb they use in that is like sanding down or taking
Yeah.
away paint. Like
He uses the term décaper, which basically means to sand the varnish off something,
sand
or
of
to
yeah, take it
sand
down.
down on a couple layers of paint that are on top of something, which
Yeah.
I think is very evocative.
Yeah.
But yeah, that term kraspedon or kraspeda, which literally means the wings or the edges of something. Many Jewish scholars look at that today and they say it wasn't so much the hem of Jesus's garments, it was what was tied to the hem of
So this
his
is not
garment.
like me getting my pant legs taken up.
No, that there was, in that world, and even today in many Jewish communities, many Jewish men wear tassels, phylacteries, on the edges of their, not phylacteries, tefillin, on the edges of their clothes. And that goes back to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Um, but many Jewish scholars said what they're talking about there is what was on the edges of his clothes were these fringes, tzitzit, that were that would have been distinctive of a Jewish man. And many Jewish scholars see that. Many Christian scholars in the last 30 years or so have said that's probably what's being talked about in Magdala in Galilee. There's a very beautiful mosaic of the church in Magdala that shows the woman with the hemorrhage reaching out for the edge of Jesus's cloak. And at the edge of his cloak, there are these tassels that are coming down, and she's reaching out for them. And there's kind of a glow as her finger is touching the tassel. So a lot of scholars say that's probably the point they were trying to make, that Jesus, as a devout Jewish man, would have worn these tassels on the edges of his cloak, and that would have signified his devotion to God. And so there was something holy about that, and that was what people were reaching out to.
Yeah.
Interesting. There's a fascinating section in the book, Murray, about the name of Jerusalem, which takes on like a plural form.
Yeah.
So of course that begs the question, are there in fact two Jerusalems? Are we learning something new here? And I wonder if you could
Well,
say more about, that duality of Jerusalem, why it's important
sure,
in
sure.
in
So
the work. Yeah.
in Hebrew, Jerusalem is Yerushalayim. And the ayim ending in Hebrew, there's 3 types of endings in Hebrew. Here's a little grammatical side note. Something can be singular, something can be plural, or something can be dual.
I'm going to
Something
interrupt
that
you there because I want to
Yeah.
just say that if you have beers with Murray around a campfire, this is the kind of wisdom that you can continue. I'm sorry.
So, no. So anything that ends in ayim,
Yeah.
it's grammatically dual. There's 2 of it. You use that for the hands, for the feet, for the eyes, for the ears. So the question is, why is it? You would never guess. All of our translations just say Jerusalem. Shiraki said, however you interpret it, there's something quirky going on here. He said the name itself is not singular. He said it is dual. And he said, now you can interpret, there's lots of different ways to interpret that. He said, but if you don't know it's there, you'll never grapple with it. So he said, I want to make it clear to people there's something here you need to pay attention to. So he slaps an S on Jerusalem wherever it occurs in his Bible translation. And of course, the casual reader takes a look at that and says, is that a typo? No, it's everywhere. Well, why is that? And that was very much his methodology. Some of you who've been to Europe will be familiar with the phenomenon of what are called stumbling stones. In front of houses of people who were taken away by the Nazis and killed, there are solid brass paving stones that are put into the pavement in front of their houses with their names and their dates of death, and they're always put about a quarter of an inch above the rest of the paving stones, so that as you're walking along, they trip you up and you have to stop and look down. And that was what he was trying to do. There were these discrepancies in the text. There were these strange grammatical or linguistic phenomena that he saw as someone who read Hebrew. But he said our translations don't make that clear, and people just skim over it, don't realize. So he said, there are ways you can understand that. The archaeologists will say that in the ancient times, there were two parts of Jerusalem. There was the lower part where the average poor people lived, and there was the upper part where the elite and the priests and the governors lived. So maybe it was the two parts of Jerusalem. There's a mystical translation that speaks of the earthly Jerusalem and the heavenly Jerusalem. And in a couple of places, St. Paul is very aware of that, and he talks about the heavenly Jerusalem, who is our mother. So Shiraki doesn't say you have to accept this particular interpretation. But what he wants is for people to slow down and look at the text and realize maybe it's more complex than you learned in Sunday school. Maybe there are things here that you've never noticed before that I would like you to pay attention to. And then as an adult, you can grapple, you can Google it, you can look up why are there two Jerusalems, and there's books on that. But you'll never look up those books unless you know that there's something strange going on here. So he does this in a number of places because he says, let us respect adult learners. Let us respect them enough to think that they can grapple with this on their own. Let's not paper over oddities let's present that in a transparent way, and then let people do the homework for themselves and decide what they want to believe.
What a novel concept. Treat
Yeah.
people like adults, eh, Rob?
Like adults.
In
Well,
the
yeah.
in the church.
And I'm listening to that. I'm thinking it's very parabolic, because it's parable stuff. It's like the whole point of the parable is that there's not one way to see a parable.
No.
Right? It's the same idea, and to get the listener and the reader to kind of turn and see a different opportunity or pathway
And I
is
love
important.
I love that analogy you gave too, Murray, of the stumbling block, right? It's just that very thing of tripping us just enough to stop and ask what the hell is going on here, right? And I
Things
think
that make you go,
That's exactly, and that was Shiraki's approach. He said, he was a little bit of a. I don't think he found himself at home in any of institutional Judaism, so he didn't feel himself beholden to any particular type of interpretation, and he was very leery of inherited interpretations that came with a layer of orthodoxy attached to them.
right.
Because
Sort of like most people who listen to this podcast who don't like it. They're very leery.
yeah. And they go, who are these guys?
And that was Shiraki. He was what they call in French an agent provocateur. He was somebody who liked to provoke, to kind of prod and challenge.
There you go,
and
stirring the
kind of a
pot up. Kevin
gadfly.
knows a bit about stirring the pot.
Well, Murray, I always tell people the Newfoundland proverb, which is he who stirs the pot of shit must also lick the spoon. And believe me, I've licked a lot of spoons in my day. Just saying.
But what I love about what Shiraki does is that he's very honest about it. He says, I'm not here to please anybody. I just want to present you with what I see, and then what you do with it is up to you. He said, but you can't grapple with it unless you know it's there. And so, when he put out the first of his translations in the 1970s, it was a bestseller. It's continued to sell really well. It's still in print
fantastic.
in French 50 years later, because people, it opened up the Bible in new ways. It brought a freshness to the Bible, and they appreciated the fact that he respected people enough not to cover things up, not to paper things over, but to present it and say, okay, here's how I understand it. Here's some different ways you might want to approach it, but what you do with it is up to you. I just want you to signal to you that this is something you might want to notice.
You see, this is what I really like about this work that you've done here, Murray, is that, and I didn't know anything about Shakari until I read this book, but I just think that's that to me is so important in terms of everything we do today. I think that the church, like, just to take it out of a Jewish context for a minute, speak about it from a Christian context, the church has for too long sort of oversimplified, pablum down, spoon-fed our people a certain brand of what Christianity is and what biblical interpretation needs to be. When in reality, it's so much deeper. It requires so much more energy and frustration and excitement and question and provocation and everything else that goes with tearing the scripture apart to get to the sense of how much richness there is in it, how much richness there is in it. So, you know, I get the sense of that in your writing, that you see this, that as it relates to the French and to the Jewish, specific, those two specific groups, Shakari really hits at those things.
Absolutely. And you know, another example that he uses, the term apostle. You know, we throw apostle and apostolic around all the time in Christian circles.
Well, you don't have to tell me and Rob, because we're not in apostolic succession, I need to tell you.
That's right.
Yeah,
We're just a little to the left.
We'll discuss that on another podcast.
Yeah. I'm just letting you know.
But the whole idea of apostles, you know, it's a very orthodox, very tightly defined group. And Shiraki says, you know, in the original term, he said, you know, first of all, in Greek, he said apostolos comes from a Greek verb apostello, which means I send you out on a mission. And he points out that there's actually in Hebrew a term for that, shaliach, the sent one, the person who goes out and is sent out as the authorized messenger and agent of someone who can negotiate contracts on their behalf. That's in Jewish law. But he doesn't use apostles anywhere. He uses the term envoys or ambassadors.
Interesting.
To me, that's a whole different register of thinking.
Talk about shifting your perspective.
Totally. And if we think about the church as apostolic, and we say it's primarily to try and be ambassadors, to try and be people who carry the message faithfully, live it, witness to it.
Right.
I think that changes completely the way that we talk about apostles and
baggage is completely different. I mean, in that context, Rob and I would fit. You know, I think we would anyway, Rob. I'm just speaking for you and me, Rob. I don't know.
No, absolutely.
That's what we all try to do, right?
Yeah.
We try to be those witnesses.
Exactly.
We try to be those messengers.
All right, just a couple of more things before we let you go. So one of them is around the papal document Nostradamus Aetate. Am I saying that right?
Nostra Aetate, yes.
Nostradamus
is something different.
Okay, yeah, all right. That's an autocorrect.
Nostradamus is the guy that predicted.
That's good. Ian, whatever you do, don't edit that out. That is fantastic.
That's a good
Nostra Aetate. In our time.
Let me just
that
say
is fantastic. That is one of the classic Kevin moments on this podcast, I have to say.
A couple of 5 or 6 years ago.
I'll have a question at the end of this, but right now I got to live in the moment.
5 or 6 years ago, I was doing a workshop on Jewish Christians, and I talked about Nostra Aetate. We'll come back to that. But this man stood up and he said, "So what is this Cosa Nostra thing you keep talking about?" I said, "No. I said, Cosa Nostra is the mafia."
It's a different.
No. Yeah.
So when WordPerfect now I'm gone back somewhere. When Microsoft Word autocorrects you to Nostradamus and you read right from this thing, you sort of spit it out. You go, what did I just say?
What am I saying?
So Nostra Aetate, in our time, it was a major step forward by all accounts. I mean, there was a lot of, you know, it wasn't far enough or it went too far, depending on who was listening to it. But in Jewish-Christian relationships, it was a big deal. And Shakare indirectly had an incredible influence on that document. And you referenced this a little bit earlier about Ishak. Can you tell our listeners first about the document itself and why it matters in our context? And I know, Murray, you're one of the people who inspire me to try and do more in an interfaith context because of the way you've lived your life. But that document matters because of that. And so why it matters now and how specifically Andre influenced that document.
Sure. So both Andre and Jules Isaac, his buddy and his co-conspirator, who, as I said, was one of the fathers of Jewish Christian dialogue, who after the war, in his conversations with Andre Shiraki, had written this book called Jesus in Israel in 1948, in which he basically lined up all the arguments for why many of the Christian understandings of Judaism were wrong and warped and needed to change. So he brought that as a result of the work that he and Shiraki were doing. He brought that to Pope John the 23rd as he was starting to get ready for the Second Vatican Council, which was going to start in 1962. And he gave him his research and he said, "You've got to do something about this." And of course, John the 23rd had been a Vatican ambassador during the war, um, had been credited with saving thousands of Jewish lives with false baptismal certificates. He really understood what had happened and how it needed to change. And he said to Shiraki, I will take this, and this will form the basis of a document, which eventually became this document Nostra Aetate that was published in October of 1965. But when it was one of the most hotly debated documents in the Second Vatican Council, because it was completely revolutionizing the way the Catholic Church thought about every religion except itself. Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, all the other religions of humanity. So for the first time,
Protestants, for that matter.
Protestants, yeah. And for the first time, the Catholic Church was willing to look at other religions and see what was good and holy and true and beautiful in them, instead of just condemning it all outright. So the day that it was finally being debated and getting, Shiraki had been invited to the Vatican by the Pope to be there as part of the audience. And he was there the day that it was officially voted on and approved by the 2,500 bishops at the Vatican and the Pope. And then he came home that night, and one of his buddies, who was a politician named Teddy Kollek, had been calling him all day saying, like, "Where are you? I need you to come back because I need you to join me on a ticket for mayor and deputy mayor of Jerusalem." So he flew home. He flew home from Nostra Aetate to what became a successful election in Jerusalem, and he became deputy mayor of Jerusalem for 8 years. So he brought that whole everything that he had learned doing interreligious dialogue to his work as deputy mayor, and he was put in charge of all the cultural and religious minorities of Jerusalem. And for 8 years, that was his responsibility, was to try and bring them together to talk to each other. So he was implementing very practically what had been going on in the debates in the Vatican.
Amazing. Okay, last question, Murray, and I want to circle back to something you mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast.
Yeah.
There you go. About Shiraki's influence on interfaith dialogue, which was tremendous. And so this is a quote from the book. You write, "For his entire adult life, Shiraki tried to find ways for three of the world's great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to view one another differently beyond the cliches and stereotypes of their pasts. Interfaith dialogue today is an established, respected form of civic engagement, and it grows year by year throughout the world, but it was not always so widespread. In the 70s, country music legend Glenn Campbell sang, 'I knew Jesus before he was a superstar,' in a similar vein. But Shiraki was really passionate about interfaith bridge building long before it ever became mainstream and cool, even before the term interfaith itself began to be widely used. So could you say a little bit more about this man's influence on that dialogue and why that was so important at the time?
Absolutely. Well, he had this driving vision that was grounded in his whole life experience, grounded in his childhood in Algeria, moving between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, grounded by his experience in the Second World War and the Holocaust, grounded by his experience in the new state of Israel, and working with all those different religious groups. So he had this firm conviction and this passion for dialogue and for that those three religions in particular had a shared vocabulary, had a shared conceptual universe that they could speak to each other if they could just move beyond the ways that they had seen each other, the painful ways they'd seen each other in the past. So he was doggedly determined that he was not going to give up on this. And he, from a young man in France, then to Israel, and then internationally, he used every opportunity that he had, both to bring Jews and Christians and Muslims and others as well together, and to establish organizations and networks and locally, nationally, internationally, that would do that work. So he knew that he couldn't do it alone, but he was constantly trying to recruit more and more people to that worldview and to give them the tools that would enable them to carry on those conversations even if he weren't there. Now, of course, he didn't do it alone. There were dozens of people in different places who were his partners and co-conspirators in that. But he just had this unfailing passion and conviction that part of what the world needed to be better was for the religions to stop hating each other, stop killing each other,
Absolutely.
come together in dialogue,
Okay.
work together, and
Wow.
and he saw some wonderful fruit from that. He was one of the people who for 40 years worked to try and bring Israelis and Palestinians together to talk to each other. He was a peace builder for his entire life. And I think about what's going on right now in the Holy Land, which breaks
Holy
my heart
hell.
on a daily
Yeah.
basis.
Yeah.
And I keep asking myself, like, how do I channel my inner Andrei Shiraki? What would he be saying to us right now? And I think that is not to give up. He saw some pretty ugly, impossible times.
Yeah.
Never surrendered, always believed that this was what God was calling him to, and that he was going to use the talents and the opportunities, the experience that he had to try and bring people together to talk to each other, to respect, to learn. And I think that is still the way today. In so many ways, that is all that is going to get us out of the mess in the Holy Land right now.
Yeah.
It's that people can find ways to sit down, talk to
Y-
each other, dialogue with each other, understand each other, and not hate and not kill.
Yeah,
I have
just
this. Go ahead,
sorry,
Rob.
Kevin. I was just going to say, just being introduced to this man now, today, as we're speaking, what I see is that reminder that's so important today in divisive times is to find the common thread, which you
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
It's all started with that.
Yeah.
Like recognize the common thread and lay that on the table first.
Yeah. In some ways, you might say he was a Nostradamus.
He was.
Yeah,
He
I guess
was.
he was.
He was seeing it, absolutely.
You could see forward. Yeah.
They
He
could.
was.
So you got it right.
Yeah. But listen, the other thing that I thought about as you were saying that, Murray, was like even just there's a section in the book as well about his first trip to the Holy Land, which I think wasn't until like the 50s or something, right?
Early 50s.
And he had this sort of romanticized idea of it. And when he got there, he saw all the mess of it in a way. Like, and that actually I think is instructive for us now too, right? Like I think, there's a lot going on over there, and there's so much brokenness, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim. There's so much political division that's going on that supersedes all of the religious stuff. But I think that for him, it sort of stripped away a lot of the romantic bits of it, right? And I think that that's a important part for us today too. Would you say?
Well, and I think that, maybe that question of the two Jerusalems can be helpful here. There is Jerusalem and the Holy Land as it is, in all of its complexity and its brokenness and sometimes its ugliness.
Yeah.
And there is the Holy Land as it can be and as it is called to be in the best of our traditions.
Right.
So how do we hold those two together? What is and what should be, what can be, and not let go of the what can be,
Right.
not get so discouraged, not get depressed, to say, okay, we're going to continue. There's a second century rabbi that I love, Rabbi Tarfon. He said, it's not up to you to finish the work, but neither may you ignore it.
Right.
And to me, that's the challenge is to say, like, I can't fix everything in the Holy Land.
Right.
I can barely, get wash my own dishes, but what can I do? What is the piece of that jigsaw puzzle that God is asking me to do?
Right.
Shiraki had certain skills and background that he brought to it, but all of us have skills that we can bring to doing dialogue and being good neighbors, to being respectful, kind, compassionate human beings. So to me, the question is, like, what is my piece of that jigsaw puzzle? And I'm going to do that.
Absolutely. Hey, yep. Great way to wrap things up for us today. Murray Watson's been our guest on the Vicar's Crossing. His book is Restoring the Gospel's Jewish Voice, Andrei Shiraki and the Intersection of Biblical Translation and Interfaith Dialogue. Murray, we can't thank you enough for giving us the time and for all your work. Thank you so much.
Kevin and Rob, thanks for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon.
And don't forget, if you're in London, June the 9th, 3:30 p.m., come on out to St. Paul's and meet Murray. Pick up a book, get it autographed because he's good at that. And we can talk about getting that Newfoundland translation of Scripture out. Murray, you're a rock star. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
All right, there goes Murray. Thanks so much. Great to meet him, and
Murray, a
nice
great
to
guy.
learn about your connection to him as well, and your long friendship and his work. So So I want everybody to pick up the book and make sure you come out June 9th to St. Paul's Cathedral to meet him and talk more about that. All right. Great, Kevin. That was wonderful. Good to be back together again. Want to say thank you
Thanks.
to our sponsors, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve, and to our good friends at Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Yes, indeed.
And that wraps up another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. We will see you again and talk
Wait
hopefully
now.
in another week or so.
Wait now, Rob. Wait now.
Oh, you're getting
I want to make
brain
a
freeze.
no. I want to make a prediction. I want to do a Nostradamus moment. I want to.
What are you seeing, oh great one?
I believe the 2024 Stanley Cup champion will be the Edmonton Oilers. And this is a Nostradamus moment. Okay.
All right. You do
Again,
Nostradamus.
because Nostradamus is amazing in this podcast.
Yeah. I'll do Karnak.
Okay, you do Karnak. Who do you predict?
Okay. The answer is the Florida Panthers.
Okay, all right. So the question must be, who will win the Stanley Cup?
There you go.
Okay, or is
The
it
Florida
who
Panthers.
who will lose to the Edmonton Oilers in the
Who will
Stanley
lose
Cup?
to the Edmonton Oilers? Right.
All right. So
There
what
we
were you
go.
going to say? You wanted me to do something about?
I wanted you to look both ways before.
Before I cross the street.
Yeah, please do that.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!